Volume 1, The Storm of Qi Xian Men Chapter 1, Village by the Mountain. Dan opened his eyes wide and stared at the black thatched roof made of straw and mud. The old quilt covering him had turned a deep yellow and had lost its original appearance, emitting a faint musty smell. Beside him, his elder brother Han Zhu was sound asleep, snoring loudly at irregular intervals. About half a yard away from the bed was a yellow mud wall, which had a few inconspicuous cracks due to its age. Through these cracks, one could faintly hear the nagging of Han's mother and occasionally the sound of Han's father sucking on his dry tobacco pipe. Dan slowly closed his eyes, which were already slightly sore. He knew that if he didn't fall asleep soon, he wouldn't be able to wake up early tomorrow and go into the mountains with his friends to gather firewood. Dan's given name was Li Han, but his parents could not come up with such a decent name. It was an old villager, Uncle Zhang, who gave him this nickname, which sounds similar to his name, by using 2 pieces of coarse food. Uncle Zhang had once been a companion and a reader for a wealthy man in the city when he was young. He was the only literate person in the village and had named more than half of the village's children. Although Dan was not really stupid, he was known as Dan in the village instead of his formal name, Li Han. This was because there was already a child named Lengzi in the village, and people had to distinguish between them. This was no big deal, as other children in the village were also called Goa and Dan, and these names were no better than Dan. So although Li Han didn't like this nickname, he had to console himself with it. Li Han was an ordinary-looking child, with dark skin and the appearance of a typical rural child. But his inner world was much more mature than his peers. He had always yearned for the rich and prosperous world outside and dreamed of one day leaving this small village to see the world that Uncle Zhang often talked about. But he had never dared to tell anyone about this idea. If he did, the villagers would be shocked that such a young child would have such a strange idea. After all, children his age in the village were still chasing chickens and catching dogs, let alone having such a strange idea of leaving their homeland. Li Han's family had 7 members, including 2 older brothers, 1 older sister, and a younger sister. He was the 4th child in the family, only 10 years old this year. Their lives were very difficult, and they could barely make ends meet every year. They rarely had meat and fish, and the whole family was always hovering around the line of subsistence. At this moment, Li Han was in a daze, trying to fall asleep as soon as possible. He knew that if he didn't, he wouldn't be able to get up early tomorrow and go into the mountains with his friends to gather firewood. The next day, at noon, Li Han carried a pile of firewood, with a bag full of berries in his arms, and rushed home from the mountain under the scorching sun. He did not know that a guest had arrived at his home who would change his fate forever. This guest was his close relative, his 3rd uncle. His parents had always talked about him as a powerful man who was the boss of a nearby city's restaurant. In the past 100 years, there had been only one relative in Han's family who had some social status, and that was his 3rd uncle. When Li Han was very young, he had seen his 3rd uncle a few times. It was his uncle who had introduced his older brother to work as an apprentice for an old blacksmith in the city. His 3rd uncle frequently sent food and other things to his parents through others, which made them very grateful. His older brother was the pride of the family, as he had heard that being an apprentice to a blacksmith in the city not only provided food and shelter but also earned 30 copper coins a month. When he graduated and was hired, he would earn even more money. Whenever his parents talked about his older brother, their eyes would light up, as if they were talking about a different person. Although Li Han was still young, he was envious of his older brother's work and dreamed of having a similar job with a craftsman in the nearby city. Therefore, when Li Han saw his 3rd uncle, who was wearing a brand new silk outfit, had a round face and a small mustache, he was thrilled. After putting the firewood behind the house, he shyly greeted his 3rd uncle and called him 3rd uncle. Then he stood obediently aside and listened to his parents' conversation with his uncle. His third uncle smiled and looked at Li Han, praised him for being obedient and sensible, and then turned to his parents to talk about the purpose of his visit. It turned out that the restaurant where his third uncle worked belonged to a martial arts sect called Qi Xian Men. This sect had both an outer and inner sect, and recently, his third uncle had become an outer sect disciple of this sect. He could recommend children between the ages of 7 and 12 to participate in the test to become an inner sect disciple of Qi Xian Men. The test to become an inner sect disciple of Qi Xian Men, which took place once every 5 years, was about to begin next month. This somewhat savvy third uncle, who had no children of his own, naturally thought of Li Han, who was of the right age. Han's father, who was always honest and hesitant, was hesitant and could not make up his mind when he heard words like martial arts and sect. He picked up his dry tobacco pipe and took a few puffs, not saying a word. In his third uncle's mouth, Qi Xian Men was naturally the most remarkable martial arts sect within hundreds of miles. If one became an inner sect disciple, one could not only practice martial arts for free, but also have enough to eat and drink. They would receive 1 or 2 silver coins as pocket money each month. Even if they didn't make it into the inner sect, they could still become outer sect members like his third uncle and do business for Qi Xian Men outside the sect. When Han's father heard that he could earn 1 or 2 silver coins a month and have the opportunity to become a respectable person like his third uncle, he finally made up his mind and agreed. After his third uncle left a few silver coins and promised to come back in a month to take Li Han away, he told Li Han's parents to take good care of him and feed him well during this period to prepare for the test. He then said goodbye to Li Han's parents, patted Li Han's head, and left. Although Li Han did not fully understand what his third uncle was talking about, he understood that going to the city could earn a lot of money. His long-standing wish was about to come true, and he was so excited that he couldn't sleep for several nights. More than a month later, his third uncle arrived at the village on time and was ready to take Li Han away. Before leaving, Han's father repeatedly reminded Li Han to be honest, tolerant and not to quarrel with others. Han's mother asked him to take care of himself, eat well and sleep well. On the carriage, Li Han watched as his parents gradually disappeared from his sight. He bit his lip and held back the tears in his eyes. Although he was more mature than other children since he was young, he was still a 10-year-old child. His first long journey made him feel a little sad and lost. His young heart secretly made a determination to come back as soon as he earned a lot of money and never be separated from his parents again. Li Han never thought that the amount of money he earned during this trip would lose its meaning to him. He unexpectedly embarked on an extraordinary path towards immortality, and created his own path of cultivation that was different from ordinary people.